I am more than a collection of wants. My desires have no control over me.
The second part of our series, which is Beyond the Mind's Desire, and this is really, really interesting stuff. This chapter is quite interesting. Yeah. Now, Ned, you start off the chapter by telling the readers that the fulfillment of your desires was the catalyst for your depression, and you mentioned that briefly in your storybook and how you met the doctor. Now, tell me more about that. Like, is there a way that you can explain that? Because I think there's a little more to it than just what was just said, what I just said there.
Yeah, I talked about that at the start in session 1 about how I completed my list. And for years, I was chasing my desires. And what I noticed is that as soon as I'd fulfill one desire, another desire would automatically arise. And, you know, I talked a little bit in the first session about, you know, how it plays out when you fulfill a desire. So my experience with fulfilling my desires is that, you know, for me, I always wanted certain things, and they were things that I put on my list of life. And like wanting my first car was my favorite way to describe this, because it was quite an experience for me. So for months and years, I had thought about owning my own car and the freedom and everything that would represent. But, and then the day finally came, and I had this new car, and as I'm driving down the road, the experience that I was having was that, you know, I was completely having it, like I was in intense joy. I was experiencing, like, felt like I was blissed out while I was driving. And it's funny because my old teacher used to tell a story about, very similar to this, about how desires create these experiences where, you know, you feel really blissed out. But the thing about it is that in the moment when I was taking the drive for the first time, it wasn't the car that was bringing me any of that joy. In that moment, I was actually desireless. You know, I didn't want for anything in that moment. And that, what I thought it was the car that was bringing me all this peace and the feeling of euphoria. But had it been the car, I would have maintained that sense of peace and well-being every time I got in the car.
Right.
But it doesn't work like that. As soon as the object gets a little bit old or we've had it for a while, new desires pop in. So I started thinking, well, maybe I could get new tires for the car, or, you know, start doing this or that, tint the windows, and you know, that was the next thing I was going to chase. It wasn't really the fulfillment of desire that brought me any lasting peace. What really brought about that sense of peace was I didn't want anything. And that's a concept that I've read in other spiritual texts, that one of the keys to life is to be fearless and desireless. And I think these are two topics that we're going to bring up and talk about a fair bit throughout this series.
Mm-hmm. And those are two things that I'm sure a lot of people, when you first hear about it, fearless and desireless, I think it's common for people to have at least some of each of those in their life. It's a very common thing to be fearful of certain things and to have desires for other things. And how to not need or have either of those may seem like, how do you do that? Like, how do you go about that? And if something you talk about in regards to desires is that when you chase your desires, it actually it leaves you with a greater attachment to your mind and its wants. So it keeps you up in your head. And so how does your mind, or how does our mind work in creating desires for us to pursue?
Well, it's a natural tendency of the mind. Your mind is constantly, there's thoughts dropping in, and then there's the dialogue with you talking back to your thoughts. And desire is a natural a natural thing that pops into us. And because the mind is always, the mind actually always wants something outside of this moment. It wants to try to repeat something from the past, or it wants to try to create something in the future. It's never happy with what's at hand. So to be desireful is a natural thing. When we're trapped in the mind, it's natural to be trapped in our desires. And I had this belief, like I was saying, that if I fulfilled my next desire, I would be at peace. But that's not how it works. Like I said, I fulfill one, the next one arises.
Yeah, and here's something that I'll say. I'll chime in on that with my own personal experience with this. And I'd really like for the listeners also to think of things that they've desired in their life, and how did you feel only a couple or 3 weeks after, or when the first payment's due. I feel that if there is a void inside of us that we're trying to fulfill, it's kind of easy and tangible to place that onto things. It's like you had said, when I get that Harley, when I get that house, the vacation property, all of these things in your mind ahead of time, you're thinking, oh, just imagine what I could do with that. So imagine how happy I'd be just on the open road or at my vacation property for the weekend, having good times. Now, the thing is with that is we could start with small things. We could start with a really small little thing that's actually kind of easy to obtain. It's fairly cost effective. It wouldn't even have to necessarily take a long time to get. However, if we notice that desire does not fulfill us for very long, what's the natural thing to do? We need to ante up. We need to now, okay, well, the little thing, that didn't quite cut it. Maybe it's a bigger thing I need. And as we get, and it takes longer to obtain those sorts of things. It takes longer to obtain a car than it would a drum set, just as an example. So is that like a pattern that people kind of get locked in, because the definition of insanity is repeating the same action, hoping for a different outcome?
Mm-hmm. Well, the real definition of insanity is to be trapped in your mind with no end in sight and being lost in the maze of the mind. That's truly insanity, because nothing ever changes, like we had said. So it's a bit of a side note from what you're asking here. The problem with desire is, it does sort of go through its own mega evolution. As we desire, we obtain one thing, we want to attain something bigger. But it's a lot of the times we trade up for something bigger because now we're not getting the same chemical response in the body. So if I gave you a candy when I saw you, you'd get excited for that, and you could use a better scenario than that. But there's a chemical release in the fulfillment of your desires as well. In the fulfillment of a desire, the body releases different chemicals that help create a sense of euphoria. And each time we fulfill one desire, we need a bigger hit to get that same chemical release, such as dopamine and different chemicals that will be present when we're in a heightened state of awareness. So fulfilling a desire does bring forth this heightened sense of awareness and a chemical rush that makes us get thrilled, or it causes us to get excited.
Mm-hmm. So that sounds like the premise of addiction then.
Pretty much.
Yeah, because you start getting these chemicals, like you said, like serotonin, oxytocin, endorphins.
Yeah, dopamine. Yeah.
And so, like, once you kind of get that hit, like you said, it's like, oh, that feels good. Or like maybe it's a reward, mm-hmm. or whatever it may be. Then the next thing, it just needs to get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you have to keep scaling it up in order to feel that same release. Yeah,
that happens a lot with gambling. You go to the casino and you win $5 and you're excited, and then next time you got to win 10 and 50 and 100, and next thing you know, you're betting $5 a spin.
Yeah, exactly. There's something that I've actually talked about this before in the Drum Gab podcast, and it actually goes back to the very first episode where my friend Kenton and I were talking about the cost involved. Now, we're talking about the cost of desires in this, but it's very interesting because in order to obtain, there has to be a cost. There's always a trade-off, and sometimes the reward or the effect is greater than the cost, and that's an ideal situation. Sometimes it's the other way around. But there's a quote that I want to read that's from the book that talks about this a little bit, and it reads, "What will the price be for the fulfillment of what I want? Does it satisfy my soul? Are you willing to work overtime, lose touch with those you love, or pay with your health for what you desire? Is what you desire worth it?" Now, the thing is there's a lot of people in the world today believing that anything they want, they can just take it. I don't know how many people listening to this know about Gary Vee, but this is like something that he would say. If it's out in the world, you can just take it. You don't even have to ask for permission. You can just work harder than everyone else and just take it. But that comes at a substantial cost that some people might not realize, or maybe they just completely disregard the cost of while it's happening. You know, like this is talked about a lot. Right now, entrepreneurialism is a hot topic, especially on social media. Everyone's building a brand. There's a lot of this sort of chatter going on, and people will talk about working 16 hours. Well, you know, if we sleep for 8, that gives us 16 to work. The problem is with that, in order to succeed in their mission, you have to put in that kind of time. Now, what is the cost of that? Now, if you're a married person, you have a child. If you're single, then this is sort of okay, I guess, because you're only holding yourself accountable. You don't have other people that are being affected by the cost of your desire. But what you have to wonder is, what was lost in order to gain, and where should people draw the line with that, do you think?
I think the real question is, does your effort serve a purpose? I think that's the first thing to ask yourself, because when you sit in front of any new endeavor, is this endeavor a pursuit of the mind or a pursuit of the soul? And that's how you started talking here when we were going into this question. If something serves a purpose, then obviously maybe it's something we will throw ourselves into. If I could just back myself up before I dove into a big project and say, what is the cost of this? Does it serve my soul? Or does it serve a purpose? Then if I answered yes to either one of those questions, then maybe, 16-hour days wouldn't be enough. You know, maybe you should push yourself to 20 hours a day.
Yeah.
And then there's other purposes. If you gave it more than 5 seconds, it'd be too much. So I think you have to look at what is the purpose of what you're doing. And life is not a win or lose situation. You know, we think, I want to win at this and succeed. It's not really about winning and losing. It's about making it a meaningful adventure. And the most purposeful life is an adventure. And we live from one moment to the next. There may be times in our lives when we do nothing for extended periods of time. Then there's times where we work like crazy. If it's purposeful, there's no loss or line to draw. You know, you say, where's the line to draw? Well, if it's purposeful, I don't know where the line would sit for you, because the line would be different for all of us. And I think the only thing to really look at is that, as long as we're maintaining a love for self and we're not losing sight of reality and our ability to be loving and caring towards others.
So where does a person check in with the purpose? Is it in your head, or like, how do we determine that? Like, because some people might be listening saying, well, I really believe that this is what I need to do. How do we assume that we have good judgment in that sense? And what part of us is telling us what our purpose is? Where does that come from? Well,
the mind can only speculate what the heart knows. The mind only knows what we've put into it, and it's a very limited slice of our experiences. Whereas the heart, it knows everything, and it knows all of eternity. So I know that's pretty abstract. So the idea is that we make this into a practice of learning how to ask ourselves these questions. And the first step when you ask yourself a question is to stop talking. I was doing a session, a mentoring session the other day, and I asked my client, I said, "Do you ever ask yourself questions?" He says, "Oh yeah, all the time." And I says, "Have you ever stopped to listen for the answers?" And he just looked at me. And I could tell the penny dropped for him. And he admitted right away, he's like, "No. I just kept asking questions." And I think that's the nature of our mind and the habit that we're in, is that we never stop talking. Our mind is like a little child, and it chatters and chatters and chatters. We'll throw a question at it and then just keep talking and talking and talking.
Wow.
You know, if you threw a question at me and then kept talking and never give me a chance to answer, you would never get that answer out of me. So we have to do the same in ourselves. There has to be a time that we pause and we just lean inward. We lean inward to the most quiet and still part of ourselves and just check in on what arises out of that space. And again, it's practice.
Yeah, because this project, for an example, this project always felt easy to be compelled. But there was also, I didn't have to convince myself, for an example, that I wanted to do it either. It just came to me, immediately hit me, yes, that is what I need to do. For what reason, I'm not entirely certain yet, but I think there's something there. And whereas other things you feel like you ought to do, but you really have to like force yourself to be motivated enough to do it. Do you think that if we're on purpose with the things that we're doing, that the motivation to complete those tasks should come to us easier?
Yes, there's sometimes when something that we're about to embark in, we just, there's a sense of importance, there's a knowingness, and that, again, that's where the heart's engaged. When there's just this automatic knowing, like, this is what I have to do. And it's not that the heart has a voice and it says, "Seamus, you're going to do a podcast on Ned's book." You know, that's not how it works. But you know that you're going to do a podcast on my book. And so this is sort of how, one of the reasons why the heart is such a difficult travel companion, because it knows things, and then if we're quiet enough, we know what it knows, but it doesn't make sense. And some things fall out of context with our current life. This is a topic we're going to get into when we, in the later portions of this podcast. It's just that. We're going to talk about that.
Yeah, because something that, again, this is common. This has become vernacular that is trendy at the moment. Is like, you've heard the word grind. You know, it's grind time. And there's like a connotation to that word that it seems to me like you really have to like sweat out the whole thing, and that there's very little pleasure. It's like getting in that extra rep when your muscles are done, and like there's a pain associated with it. That's the way that I visualize the word. When if someone says I'm grinding, I see them struggling and not necessarily like motivated. It's like they're convincing themselves to put in that extra hour work. Whereas I feel that when you're really doing something that you're passionate about, the passion drives that bus. You don't really have to work too hard at finding the motivation to do that. So that's a very common thing. That, I don't know, that's just something I see so much of out there. When I talk about the 16-hour day, like you had said, well, maybe there's not enough time in the day to do what you ought to do. I would say it's pretty easy to sit down and do a whole lot of prep, like for a podcast, if you're just so dialed in with that and you can't wait to get working on it.
That's right.
Like if you think about it and it excites you, you become motivated. That's the byproduct of excitement. But then there's things that we're told as an outside influence that we ought to do. And it might even be, the source may even be desires that we see in advertisements when we see that new car commercial, or we see, I don't know, there's a whole pile of examples that you could use, but some of those things fuel our motivation.
Well, that's a hidden desire. We start to want hidden desires.
So what does that mean exactly? Because there is like secret desires as well. How would you define a hidden desire?
A hidden desire is a motivation inside of ourselves that we may not be consciously aware of. So an advertisement, like you just said, or if you're a person who's insecure, you may have a hidden desire to be boastful or overtly loud, to assert your presence so that you feel like you're asserting your worth, or you may go the extra mile to affirm your worth in life. But the hidden desire is what's motivating certain behaviors.
Well, like for an example, what if somebody has this extreme need for acknowledgement? So you need to be praised every time that you do something good or you complete a task and it's a good quality thing. Let's say that you're a carpenter or a builder or something and you're finished making it. You need acknowledgement from people that you respect for what they do, and that acknowledgement is going to mean the most to you if it's coming from someone that you look up to. Perhaps it's even that you desire their ability to do whatever it is that they do. So if these sorts of things sound to me like they're more deep rooted within us, these might be things that might go way back into our childhood. Is that a possibility that more of them are rooted in our childhood or early in our life rather than opposed to later?
They can be our motivators, which are our hidden desires. So if we look at hidden desires, break it down in the most simple form, it's our motivators. So our motivators can stem from early events in our life, but they can also come from current events that are happening, and we suddenly have this hidden desire we need something out of this moment. And our hidden desires are not always obvious to us. They're deep inside the motivations, and they have a lot to do with our behaviors and how we respond to things. Nothing happens without motivation. So we have to, from time to time, pause and look at our motivations. Why do I want this? Or look at your motivations to behave certain ways. For instance, I can be an overachiever. When I wrote my book Be Love, I ended up writing 2 books. I wrote my book Be Love, and then I wrote another book called On the Path with Love, Daily Inspirations.
Right.
So it was part of a marketing plan, but so that when people bought on Amazon, if they bought 1 book, you have to pay for shipping. If you buy 2, you get free shipping. So it was a way to get my customers free shipping. But it's sort of an overachiever move. But I've been an overachiever all my life, and it was years ago. What drove me to be an overachiever was my insecurities. I was very insecure, and I didn't feel I was good enough. Now at this point in my life, I can use that energy that I have to achieve and plunge it into something that's positive. And I never work myself to the point where I'm totally in exhaustion. I used to burn myself right out just for the sake of overachieving, on the chance that I might get a pat on the back.
Mm-hmm. So would this be something that people may want to take inventory of as well and sort of look at their habits and you say you're an overachiever. That would be an example. Perhaps some listeners might relate to that. They might see some of themselves in that. Mm-hmm. Is that something that we can take inventory of to maybe trace back to what's causing that issue?
Yeah, absolutely. Look at why you do the things you do. And it's a way of just peeking in on your life. Just look in on your life like it's not your life that you're living. Just you're just peeking in on, look what this character's doing. Why is he doing that? Almost put yourself in a third person position.
Yeah.
You can learn a bit about yourself, and it also helps you gain a greater context of the moment at hand when you're not so deeply entrenched in your own mind and emotions or behaviors.
So if we take inventory of our desires, the hidden desires, we start to look at that and then we trace it back to certain things. What if some of those hidden desires is a byproduct of a conflict that cannot be resolved? Maybe it's a relationship with someone who's not even here anymore. So if resolution isn't within the realm of possibility for some people, how do we as people learn to accept what can't be resolved?
That's a good question, because there's a certain amount of scenarios that play out in our life where somebody harms us and then maybe they move away and we lose contact with them, and we really want or need resolve with that person. So there is a portion of our hidden desires that are created from unresolved conflicts. Now, just because you can't resolve your conflict with someone in the past, it doesn't mean that you can't heal yourself and move on. I think that's when we do that, if we do that, we're placing our power in somebody else. And I think it's a matter of pulling that back to you and claiming your own power, not requiring a person to do or say anything to help us heal. We have to learn how to heal ourselves. And because the world does not have to change for us to be at peace. And that's sort of the expectation that we're putting on. If we have an unresolved conflict with somebody else, you're saying that person holds your peace. But they don't hold your peace, you do. Your ability to let that conflict go in you is what's going to help move you into healing, and not allowing that past unrelated conflict to keep throwing itself back in the moment in front of you. And we're going to talk a little bit about how to heal and how to heal conflicts with other people.
Yeah, because I was just about to mention that if there is a common theme throughout the book where it talks a lot about self-sufficiency in providing yourself with everything you need to obtain peace in your life. In every situation that it's mentioned, you immediately understand how, well, in my case anyways, how I did expect that to come from someone else. That, the things outside and the things in my world are somehow the contributors to my peace of mind, or maybe I feel happy or I feel pleasant because somebody else gave me the acknowledgement that I really seek. Because that's something you mentioned, overachiever. With certain circumstances, I'm a similar way, and where I feel like I need to do the best thing possible with something that I have a skill set within. If I have a skill set within something, I become incredibly competitive with myself to become really, really good at it, because earlier on in my life, I felt really inefficient with certain things. Like there's just certain things I wasn't very proficient with. Like I'm not a handy person. This is something like with men. I know you talked about you did men's workshops, and I was actually at one of them. And, when you're a man and you're an adult, a young man, and you're growing up, you identify masculinity with being able to fix something. How much weight can you lift? How much facial hair is on your face? And are you attracting women and all of these sorts of things? You place a lot of importance on those aspects, and that's what makes up your masculinity. So if you're a late bloomer, you're kind of scrawny, you're not very good at fixing things, all of a sudden you're really diminishing your masculinity and how you feel about yourself. And for women, it would be something entirely different that they would assume their femininity with. And so, like, that's something where I try to sometimes overachieve to compensate for the things I feel I lack, because there was like a spotlight on these things, because a role model in my life was very good at everything I sucked at. Mm-hmm. And I felt that that was being a man. So I think that's really interesting if we really take a deep dive in all the listeners, that if they were to think about the things that they do to compensate for some of the things that they consider weaknesses of their own, that sort of is a conflict of identity in the social sense, mm-hmm. and start to look at that and see if maybe there's ways to help with that.
Absolutely.
Now, another topic that you talk about is secret desires. And this is kind of interesting. So we just talked about hidden desires, but now we get into secret desires. So if you could unpack that a little bit for us.
Sure. This is one of my favorites to talk about when it comes to desires. Secret desires this is a concept that I created through my own experiences. So by definition, a secret desire is a desire that we're having that we seldomly express to another. But when the other person doesn't fulfill that desire, we become disappointed, hurt, upset, outright angry. I noticed in my relationships that secret desires would play out very frequently. I would be, say, working really hard for weeks on end without days off, and going to work in the factory, and then tattooing when I got home, and then just working 7 days a week. So I may have one day off or an evening off, and if my wife asked me to, my ex-wife, if she had asked me to cut the grass, I may lose it. You know, I had this expectation or this secret desire in me that she wouldn't dare ask me to do anything for her. Or, you know, I'd have a secret desire that while I was at work in the factory, that my ex-wife would be making me a really nice supper, and I'd get home and she'd say, "Where we're going for supper?" And I'd be angry because I had this desire that she would have just had it ready for me. That played out many times and in so many scenarios in my previous marriage, where I had these expectations placed on my ex-wife, and she had no idea what I wanted, but I was angry because she wasn't doing it. You know, when you put it out in the open and look at, you know, what we do with these secret desires, it becomes very obvious that communication, you know, would solve my old problems with my ex-partner. If I could just say, I could just call her from work and say, "Hey, would you be able to make something for supper? I've got a busy night tonight." You know, it would have resolved a great deal of conflicts that her and I were having. You know, that's where I brought a lot of drama and trauma.
Why do you think, though, that people avoid communicating those desires and things that they would like to have from their partners, or just anyone? You know, why do you think people avoid that and just keep it up here in their head?
It's because I think the mind expects things. And it's part of expectation. We assume that other people know what's going on in our mind, and that's quite an assumption to make. So I would assume that my wife would know, or be observing at very least, how busy I was, or I would assume that my wife would understand, you know, what I was thinking and feeling about any certain thing, and then when she didn't live up to those expectations and she started asking things of me that I couldn't do, I would just get angry.
Yeah, because at the same time you're thinking, well, there's these things that I wanted you to do and you haven't done them. Why would I do more for you? Because that's now, and we'll get into that later with the relationships chapter, but just a little spoiler, I suppose, is the give and take, the 50-50. You give and you take in a relationship.
Well, in my past relationships, that's how it played out. I have a whole different scenario that I'm going to introduce later, And this is may come to a surprise to a lot of people, but listen in on the session number 6, relationships. We're going to have some really interesting concepts there that is not traditional.
With secret desires, so we talk about why we don't communicate those things. Like when you talk about working extra hard and then you're expecting dinner, you're expecting these little things from your spouse, like where do you think that comes from? Like because when you're saying that sort of stuff, to me, I'm thinking that must have been a routine that you're familiar with when you were younger or something. Like that became something you come to expect while you were growing up, and maybe that's the way things were in the household. Like, is that true, or is it something else, do you think?
Well, yeah, I think it's a combination of a few things. It's a combination of our past, and it's a combination of the dynamics that we set up in our relationships. Mm-hmm. So we can create a scenario where we do the same things. The mind is most happy when it's recreating the same scenario day in, day out, because the mind has the same thoughts day in, day out. So there's a certain comfortability to the ego when we recreate old scenarios. So if our parents did something a certain way, we may do it the same way. And again, that's where I think it's important to back up from your life and peek in and say, is this serving me? Is this what I really want?
Another thing that pops to mind too is the needing to be understood. You know, like that's a sign of appreciation. Like if there's certain things behaviorally that you yourself know very well about, call them quirks even, whether they be positive or negative ones. I think that people like the thought that someone else knows that about them and responds to that without you having to remind them, that it's them understanding you. And some people are easier understood than others, but I think that may also be part of that. And that's how I'm relating to it at least. Now, that's how I'm relating to that is the needing to be, or feeling like you need to be understood. Could be a pretty universal, maybe secret desire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we want our partners to know, how to respond and take care of us all the time, sometimes without communicating that. And again, that's what forms the basis of what I call a secret desire, is to want somebody to do something without asking.
So you sum up the chapter where you're talking about how your peace does not come from fulfilling your desires, but instead it comes from surrendering to them. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, it's in surrendering the mind, you open up a space for peace to arise in. And surrender is sort of the thing that, it's the motion of turning the knob on the door. If we don't surrender the mind, we are pretty much trapped in it. When we don't surrender the mind is full of desire. And I think that kind of sums up desires. Desires don't come from the heart. The heart doesn't, and that's a fallacy that I've discovered in me, that my heart wants anything. To want is from the mind, whereas my heart, it knows. It simply knows. And that's the difference between a desire and a knowingness. So how do we get to what the heart knows? Is that we surrender. We surrender the mind. We realize that the mind, is going to want, and the mind is constantly going to want for things. For me, a simple lineup in the grocery store could be absolutely painful for me. In short of throwing myself on the ground and having a temper tantrum, that's pretty much how I would respond in my own mind, because my desires were so out of check. You know, I would, and that's the thing about the mind, is it always wants for something different than what's happening now. You could be having the best day of your life, and your mind can creep back in and say, this be better if. Mm-hmm. You know, I knew a person that, you know, this person, when anything that happened in their life, they'd say, well, it could be better if they bought a little gadget, they'd say, well, it's too bad this button wasn't put over here.
Right.
And to watch this person, it was almost comical when I caught on to what was happening. What I realized is that they were just so caught up in what they wanted and needed, and they felt like they needed to micromanage and control everything.
Yeah.
Including electronic goods that they've bought, and they would almost like to call the factory and have them rearrange the buttons just to suit their desires.
So when you say the word surrender sounds like giving up, how is it different from that? Because if people are hearing surrendering your desires, does that mean giving up on them? Like, I don't know, is it okay to have some desires? Like, are desires all bad, or are there some good ones? Like,
well, I think it could be framed in, you know, I will or I won't, instead of I want and I need. And that's the difference between being desireful and purposeful. A purposeful endeavor is something that you will do, and it's just going to happen. Mm-hmm. But there's no part of you that needs. A healthy desire, I don't know. Like, I think it's either I will or I won't, or I need it or I don't. You know, does it? And then it's a matter of learning how to look at what the mind wants. Because my soul doesn't want, it wants for nothing. And it doesn't mean that I think that we should sit around and do nothing. But I think what's more important is to plunge yourself into things that are very purposeful, and not that we want for those things, but it's just to experience it and to be flexible and allow life to reveal the subtle nuances of how it's going to unfold. We can't control how life is going to unfold. We try to, and that's where desire creates a lot of our problems, is we're trying to create and micromanage how things are unfolding. You know, from my perspective, desire is born from the mind, and it's the mind seeking peace. Our peace cannot be experienced in the mind, for it's not a conceptual idea that's contained in your mind. Peace is a pervasive experience that delivers us into the nature of our soul. It's the result of the direct contact we have and our connection with the divine that lives within inside of us. That's a little heavy.
Yeah, that is a little heavy. But I mean, all of this sort of stuff will be covered later on. And I think the upshot of this in this session is talking about how, like you had said, your mind's way in obtaining peace, or what it thinks it needs to obtain peace, is by having desires to fulfill.
In a little caption that I pulled out of the book here about desire, and this is taken directly from my book, desire invites the mind into the past and future because it's never content with the moment at hand. Your desires will place burdens on your life and your friendships. When you are desireless, you remove some of the needs you place on others. It makes for more harmonious relationships with your friends and family and acquaintances. They don't feel they have to keep up your expectations.